Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 585. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about deserts and geysers and volcanoes, salt flats, flamingos, llamas, copper mines, and mummies as we go to Northern Chile. Welcome to Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We'll hear more from our two sponsors later on in this episode, but first, let's talk about Northern Chile. I'd like to welcome to the show Steph Dyson from worldlyadventurer.com, guidebook writer and travel writer, and she has come to talk to us about Chile. Steph, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
And why are we talking about Chile? What is your relationship with the country? You are not from Chile.
No, so I'm actually originally from the UK and I moved to South America 3 years ago and have actually lived in a couple of different countries here, but arrived in Chile about a year and a half ago. Actually met my boyfriend who is a Chilean, and a month's trip in Chile turned into a year and a half, and I'm still here now and have fallen desperately in love with this country and do my best to see as much of it and write as much about it as possible.
And what led you to South America originally?
I think it was the excitement of going to somewhere that I didn't know many people who visited there before. A lot of it as well was the idea of learning a language. The great thing about South America is if you can speak a bit of Spanish, you can visit so many different countries that are very unique and very culturally very different and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that was definitely a real push for it. And I think I just wanted an adventure. I was ready to give it my job and see what happened. And something about South America just called to me. So I went.
Excellent. Well, and why should someone follow in your footsteps and go to Chile? Although perhaps not move there, but to visit Chile.
I think one of the things that I love so much about Chile is the real diversity of natural landscapes here. It's really a country for people who like being outdoors and who like experiencing nature, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the world's driest desert, the Atacama in the north. You've got Patagonia with its glaciers and ice fields and king penguins and all sorts of things in the south. And then in the middle of the country, you've got vineyards, you've got volcanoes, you've got beaches, you've got places to go skiing. There's pretty much everything that you could possibly think of doing outdoors, you can do here in Chile.
Excellent.
I think that's the reason that so many people are now seeing it as a good destination to go to.
Great. What kind of itinerary would you recommend for somebody who is coming who has, say, 1 to 2 weeks?
There's plenty of places you can see in 1 to 2 weeks.
We're talking about a long, tall, skinny country, so seeing all of it is not going to happen in 1 to 2 weeks.
No, definitely. And I think people who try and see too much of the country in too short a time, it's exhausting. You spend a lot of time on a plane or on the bus, and it's just not worth it. But I think in terms of 2 weeks, I've just returned from the north of Chile, and it's a place that not that many people actually go to. People often go to Patagonia or Isla de Pascua, Easter Island. But the north of Chile is definitely a place that more people should go to. It's got a real fascinating range of things to do up there.
Okay. Where would you start us?
The easiest place to fly into is Calama. It's the kind of regional airport. It's basically a big mining town, so it has a lot of direct flights from the capital, and they're pretty cheap as well.
Okay, so we'd fly first into Santiago and then up to Calama.
Yeah, and I think it's about 2 hours on the plane. Just enough time to get to see the Andes Mountains, so make sure you sit on the right-hand side of the plane to get the best views.
Okay, and what are we going to do in Calama?
From Calama, there is the world's biggest open copper mine, which for some people might find that interesting. A lot of people would go directly to San Pedro de Atacama, which is about an hour and a half away and appeals to more people, I think.
So you sound like you are not one of those some people who find that interesting.
Well, I didn't actually get to visit it when I was there, but I've heard it's pretty impressive. But it's just this huge mine. So I think from the social perspective as well, it's very interesting because so many people make a living out of mining. But it's not the most beautiful place that Chile has to offer. Let's put it that way.
Right. No, an open pit mine would not be, but they are fascinating. I saw one in, I think, North Island of New Zealand. I think is the last time I've seen a large mine. I don't remember whether it was a copper mine or not, but I think it may have been a gold mine, but it was a large open pit mine. Yeah, not the most beautiful place, but interesting in terms of the details of what's going on and the scale.
Yeah, definitely. The vehicles that are there are just the most enormous things you'll ever have seen. I don't know how many floors they are, but the sense of scale. And copper is one of the most important parts of the economy here in Chile. It does tell you, I think it's quite symbolic of kind of Chile and its place in the world and the importance of the mining industry as well.
Okay. And then you headed us off from there. And I've quite forgotten where you headed us to already, so I won't pretend that I do.
So you head east towards San Pedro de Atacama. And this is probably one of the most well-known parts of Chile. It's part of the Atacama Desert, and it's where you've got salt flats, not as big as in Bolivia, not as big as the Salar de Uyuni, but still really very beautiful. The whole landscape looks a little bit like being on the moon. And as well, you've got the highest geyser field in the world. I think they're about 4,500 meters above sea level. And they're absolutely beautiful if you go at dawn, because of how cold it is when you can really see the water and the steam coming out of the geysers. And it's really very beautiful.
And your word geysers is my word geysers?
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. Okay.
And there's just very beautiful lakes as well, really high altitude. It's very difficult walking around when you get there, but it's really worth getting out of the town. There's lots of tours you can take, or you can rent a car and drive around. And just the scenery itself is absolutely spectacular.
In terms of driving around, not an issue driving around in terms of how easy it is and the traffic and the driving ethos and things like that?
There's very little traffic. We're talking this town, I don't know, it's probably got a couple of thousand inhabitants. It's very small. It's got more tourists than it has people who live there, I think.
Okay.
Most of the roads are now tarmac, are paved. There are some dirt roads. I have seen people get stuck in the dust in their vehicle. So it's either you get a four-wheel drive or you do not deviate from the main roads, because you can end up getting stuck a little bit.
Okay. And when we're getting on the road, where are you heading us out to?
So there's lots of options. So San Pedro is where most people stay. It's where the sort of restaurants and hotels and things are based.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got in the north is where the geyser field is.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you head south, that's where you start approaching the national park, which then has lots of saline lakes filled with flamingos. You've got volcanoes that you can see surrounding these lakes. And if you head out east as well, sort of towards the border with Bolivia, because at this point you're very, very close to Bolivia and Argentina. A lot of people cross into the countries from this point.
Mm-hmm.
And if you head out east, that's where you find some of the sort of wilder bits. These are the places you do need to go with a tour because it's just too hard to get to them otherwise.
Well, and you say that these are close. As I recall my South American history, I think Bolivia and Chile actually had a war fighting over this desert, which may seem odd to people in terms of this is not a place that is filled with life or looks like there's a lot to fight over, but it was over the mineral deposits and things like that in the area.
Yeah, it was called saltpeter, nitrate, and actually copper as well. Basically, where this huge copper mine is now, it's in Chilean territory, was originally in Bolivian territory. So Chile actually did very, very well out of the war, which saw them gain all of this bit of, what seemed like not particularly useful to anyone did turn out to be economically quite important.
Yeah, and I think it was largely, as you said, the saltpeter, because this is before the process was invented in Germany to fix nitrogen from the air, back at a time where people were actually predicting that crops would all run out and die because we were going to run out of natural fertilizers. And so, at the time, this was a very, very, very valuable piece of real estate.
Indeed, it basically was, the saltpeter was the reason that the War of the Pacific between Peru and Bolivia and Chile.
I would recommend, for knowing about that whole process and that whole mentions of the war, but that whole process of why that became less important, read The Alchemy of Air, about the invention of fixing nitrate from the air. And let's take a break here and hear from the first of our two sponsors. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by GoTenna. After Hurricane Sandy, which knocked out all the cell towers, the makers of GoTenna were inspired to create this device, which is a mesh network radio. You connect this device to your cell phone, for instance, and you can connect to other people who have a device like this, whether or not there are cell towers or power or whatever. And not only can you connect to other devices, but you can connect through them to devices still further away. And if you're interested in GoTenna, you can go to GoTenna.com, GoTenna.com. Check the show notes for the links and save $25 by using the code AmateurTraveler25. Thanks to GoTenna for sponsoring this podcast. So you mentioned also volcanoes. We kind of glossed over the volcanoes, active or dormant.
I think they're all mainly dormant.
Okay.
There potentially could be some that are active, but when I was there was one that was steaming from a distance. So yeah, they are mildly active, but unlike some of the ones in Chile which explode very forcefully, these ones are pretty calm.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the dormant volcanoes in Chile when I was there a couple of years ago, and the one that we were looking at down by Punta Arenas, it has been less dormant since I was there. Some spectacular eruptions have happened in that area. And we would recommend we're viewing from a distance, or are there particular hikes you would recommend to see that area?
Well, there are definitely hikes that you can do up some of the volcanoes. You can do some volcano hiking. There are agencies specifically aimed at doing that. And again, it's something that you can't do by yourself. You do need specialist equipment because you are hiking at altitude. We're talking going up to 4,500, maybe even 5,000 meters above sea level. And that's really very tough to walk at that height anyway.
Okay, got it. So not something we're going to do our first day in at the altitude, especially if we're flatlanders like I am.
Exactly.
Any agencies you would recommend that you have used in that area?
No.
Okay, that's all right.
The Lasca volcano is the best known one to go up. The good thing about San Pedro de Atacama is that all of the agencies are based on the main road, Caracoles it's called. There's only a handful of agencies that actually do this hiking and everything like that at the volcanoes. So they're pretty easy to find.
Okay.
Definitely something that's worth planning for because, you do need to acclimatize. And San Pedro de Atacama is about 2,300 above sea level, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Just, yeah, having a couple of days there, taking some day trips out to other parts of the region is a good way to get used to the altitude before you do start hiking.
Okay, probably start with some driving trips and then do some walking trips and then think about doing a hiking.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good way of doing it.
Okay. Anything else we want to see in the region here?
My favorite place that I went to when I was there in San Pedro de Atacama was Piedras Rojas, which means red rocks.
Okay.
And it's actually a lava flow just a few hours south of San Pedro de Atacama. And it's basically, they look like cobblestones, but they're really red because of the iron content. And it's right next to this really beautiful saline lake with a bit of a salt flat. And it's surrounded by volcanoes. It's becoming a lot more popular now than when I first went. It's very surreal to have all of these pastel shades of volcanoes as well, showing how much mineral content is in them and everything. It's one of my favorite places that I've been to in that region. It's stunning.
Okay. Is there anything else we want to talk about in the region, or did you want to add on something to our itinerary here?
I would love to quickly mention as well that one of the reasons that people go to San Pedro de Atacama is because the conditions are some of the best in the world for stargazing.
Okay.
And they actually have ALMA, which is a huge radio telescope based there. A project in collaboration with Chile and I think with space stations from Europe and from the States. So that's a huge telescope that's doing research into the universe and everything there, which you can visit, but only during the day. You can't actually get to see what they're seeing through their telescopes. But there's a really excellent observatory tour called Space, who have the largest observatory open to the public in South America, and they do tours in English as well as in Spanish, where they talk you through the night sky and then give you a chance to look through their telescopes. And they're really worthwhile.
Well, and you mentioned doing English tours. If you haven't been practicing your Spanish, what is the accessibility for people who are speaking English in the region?
In the region, in San Pedro, there are plenty of English speakers, and you very easily will find a tour that's in English. Some of the other places I'm going to suggest, it's a little bit less easy, but there are still agencies where you can arrange a tour guide who does speak English.
Okay. Well, and we would definitely recommend, especially if you're going to spend a fair amount of time in South America, picking up some Spanish is a good idea. And one of the easier languages, I would say, for English speakers to pick up, but that's coming from somebody who lives in California where all the place names are in Spanish. That may not be your experience if you're someplace else. Excellent. Where should we go from here?
So really, if you've got 2 weeks to travel from San Pedro, I would recommend you head north along the Pan American Highway up to Iquique. And this is a coastal city. It's known as the Miami of South America. And I don't think it has an awful lot in common with Miami. I think it's just because it's by the beach and has some skyscrapers. It's a nice little city. It's a good way to break up the drive as well, because the thing about Chile is the distances are all very large. And if you're going over land, which in the north you kind of have to, it's nice to have places to stop along the way.
Okay. And so we're going up here for a beach break, or what are we doing here?
Yeah, so Iquique is good for a beach break, definitely. It's got some really big family-friendly beaches right on the front of the city. So they're literally within walking distance of most of the restaurants, the bars, the hotels and things. But Iquique is also known for its adventure sports.
Okay.
Basically, it's surrounded by sand dunes. And from the sand dunes, you can actually do parapenting or paragliding and jump and basically float over the top of the city and see the Pacific Ocean in front of you and then land on the beach.
Now, you said paragliding, or the other term you used was?
Parapenting. I think they mean the same thing.
Okay. I've just never heard that term. Okay.
I think it might be the French term for it anyway, but yeah, paragliding.
Okay. And let's take a break here and hear from our second and final sponsor. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Time Slippers. There's one company that is set out to make relaxing as easy as possible. It's Time Slippers. They have reinvented traditional house slippers with the sole purpose of making your feet more comfortable than ever, even on the go. They boast a modern design so you can wear them out of the house and no one will even know you're wearing slippers. They have yoga mat insoles and a plush wool lining to keep your feet cozy and warm. They slip on and off so you can fly through airport security lines with with ease. It's a really great gift for the holidays. Use the code AMATEURTRAVELER for 20% off your first pair. You can only get them at timeslippers.com.
No, the other term you
That's
used was
Paraventing. I think they mean the same thing.
www.timeslippers.com.
Okay, I've just never heard
And
that
thanks
term.
to Time
Okay.
Slippers
I think
for
it might be the
sponsoring
French
this
term, but
episode
anyway, but yeah,
of Amateur
paragliding.
Traveler.
Okay. Are there other things that we should see there in terms of getting closer connection with the culture?
I think Iquique as well, the culture is based around the sea quite a bit. There's also a lot of surfing that goes on there. It's got some of the best surfing in the world. So a lot of the Iquiqueños, which is what the locals are called, they spend a lot of time out in the waves. There's also some really good restaurants in Iquique. Particularly, you can find some lovely restaurants that serve local empanadas. It's the ubiquitous sort of South American snack. In this part of Chile, they're deep fried. So they're deep fried pastry with cheese and maybe some seafood inside it. And they are absolutely delicious.
Okay. Any particular restaurants you would recommend?
So if you want to go and get some really good local empanadas in Iquique, there's basically this little peninsula. It's sort of in the south of the city. It's basically where most of the restaurants and bars are now located and some of the kind of posher hotels. And there's this great little family-run restaurant called El Rincón de Chacapueto. And you have to go there at lunchtime. You need to get there early, no later than sort of midday. Otherwise, they'll run out of empanadas. But they are supposedly the best ones in the whole city.
Excellent. Anything else we want to do in Iquique?
In Iquique, one of the other good things to do in terms of getting to know the culture is to take a wander down the main street, which is called Paseo Baquedano, because Iquique was another city that was fought over during the war between Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. And it has a lot of British influence. All these British companies came to do the saltpeter mining.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting city with some very historical buildings that were built when the British first got there. And a lot of them have been destroyed because, unfortunately, Iquique gets an awful lot of earthquakes. And I think there was a tsunami a couple of years back as well.
Well, and that's true with a lot of Chile. We're talking about a very geologically active region because we're right at, well, when you look at the map of South America and you see the Andes, you can tell there's something going on here. There's two plates running into each other with some great force right now.
And that is part of traveling in Chile. You do have to get kind of used to the fact that you probably will experience some earthquakes when you're here. The good thing is, when I was in the north of Chile a few weeks back, I actually apparently was driving through the epicenter of an earthquake and didn't notice. So sometimes you get very used to these things.
For those of us who live in earthquake country, it's been years since I felt one here, even though I'm sure we've had 100 in the last week.
Yeah.
So just because you have earthquakes doesn't necessarily mean they rise to the level of being particularly interesting. When they do get interesting, they get very interesting sometimes. But
yeah. This part of Iquique is great just to wander down this main road and there's lots of museums. Luckily, all the museums in Iquique are free as well. So,
particular museum you would recommend?
I really enjoyed the Museo Regional de Iquique, the regional museum. It's got such a range of things there, and it doesn't have an awful lot of information in English, but you can wander around and get an idea of what's in there. But one of the most interesting parts was they had a whole section on textiles made in a community very close to Iquique. It's not something you find so much in Chile. These types of textiles, they're more associated with Andean communities, but they're really, really beautiful. And I would definitely recommend going into the museum to have a look at that information and seeing these really intricate textiles there.
Okay. And do you remember the name of the community nearby that these are from?
Yeah, so the community is an Aymara community, so it's an indigenous community called Iluga.
Okay. I just asked that because we definitely have some fans of the shows who are quite into textiles, and so you just got their attention there. So
fantastic.
Excellent. Anything else in Iquique, or is it time to move on?
I think it's time to move on.
Do we have time left in our itinerary here?
We do have time left in our itinerary. So from Iquique, it's a couple of hours drive, again, up the Pan American Highway, directly north to Arica. And Arica is the final city before you get into Peru. Arica is a city that most people don't ever go to, and it's a real shame. I fell in love with Arica a little bit when I was there a few weeks back. It's just got so much culture that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And one of the things that makes Arica so interesting is the fact that it contains the world's oldest mummies.
Okay, these are Incan mummies?
No, these aren't Inca mummies. They are the Chinchorro.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they predate the Incas by
Interesting.
thousands of years.
Okay.
They predate the Egyptian mummies by 2,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't understand why there's not thousands of people pouring into Arica every day to see these mummies, but that's where they are.
Well, and you say not that many people get here. We're down in the Atacama Desert, and I said, "Where do we go next?" And you said north, and I had to look at a map because when people describe Chile itineraries, usually they talk about maybe getting to the Atacama Desert, and so you said head north, and I was like, there is something further north of that. So yeah, we're talking about a region that a lot of people don't go to on a typical Santiago based, or when you're going down to Patagonia, for instance. We're quite a ways from there.
Yeah.
We mentioned it was a tall, skinny country. We didn't mention how tall and how skinny. So from north to south, it's 2,653 miles or 4,270 kilometers. And yet the east and west, the average width is 110 miles or 177 kilometers. So really just that edge, that coast of South America. So yeah, we're really doing the northern part of it. We've done other episodes which are on the much, much further south part of it. So we haven't talked about this region before too, which is one of the reasons I was interested in talking to you.
That's why I wanted to offer this itinerary, because I love Patagonia and I love, there's so many parts of Chile that are better known. And I'm really, having literally just come back from this part of Chile and been wowed and surprised by it. It's somewhere that I really do want people to know about and actually start thinking of putting on their itinerary.
So back to the mummies. Where are we going to see those?
So you've got two places. Right in the city is the Museo de Sitio Colón 10. So this is basically an old house that back in 2004 was being renovated to become a hotel. And as they were digging up the foundations, they came across the remains of the Chinchorro mummies. And they carbon dated them to 5050 BC.
Wow.
So they're pretty ancient. And what is so wonderful about this museum is the fact that they basically have left it the way it was. They've cleared the walls out of inside and everything. So you go in and there's this huge room, and then the bodies are still preserved in situ because they were too delicate to move anyway. But there's basically a sheet of glass over the top of them. So you can actually stand over the top of these 48 mummified bodies. There's children, there's adults, everything. And look at them, like get really, really close up and see, because they have different mummification techniques that were used to preserve the bodies and lots of different things that were buried with them. So they're just fascinating to look at.
And so these are intentionally mummified from what I'm reading. There have been naturally mummified remains found in the Atacama Desert back to 7,000 BC. But this is somebody intentionally was preserving their dead in this fashion. Interesting.
Yeah. The great thing about this museum as well is that you get an audio guide, which is available in English. So you can learn so much information about it. It's a really good museum.
And you said there were two places.
Outside of Arica, which is the city, it's about a 20-minute drive. You can take a taxi or you can organize a tour from actually within the city. But there's the Museo Arqueológico San Miguel de Azapa.
Okay. And I assume in San Miguel de Azapa.
Yeah. So that is basically a little town. It's really known for its olive growing as well. There was just a lot of Andalusian olives. So you can go and eat those as well. But they have the bulk of the mummies that have been found. And this is a much bigger museum than the one in town.
Okay. Interesting. And that is also worth the trip out there, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. Again, they've got an audio guide. There's a lot more information. There's a lot more on display because they've actually got sort of things, clothing, baskets and things that were used by the Chinchorro sort of in their daily life. One of the most interesting bits I actually almost missed, because you come into the museum down a staircase. It opens out into this big room where they've got display cabinets full of clothes and things used for hunting. But actually underneath the staircase itself, if you go through, there's a glass door, and behind it are basically, I don't know how many mummies, but they're all basically in glass cabinets. There's just row upon row upon row of mummies
Hmm.
in this room. And you can't go in, but you can look at it through the door. And it's just, I think it's just incredible to get a sense of the sheer number. I think it's about 300 mummies that they have excavated.
Hmm. Interesting. Anything else we want to do in the Arica area before we start to summarize and wrap up?
So from Arica, the final place that I would very much recommend people go to is up into the Precordillera and the Altiplano.
Okay.
So the Precordillera basically means the bit before the mountains, and the Altiplano is the high altitude area, which we saw a little bit of when we were near San Pedro de Atacama.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, this is the alternative to San Pedro de Atacama. Unfortunately, San Pedro has got to become a bit of a victim of its own success over the past 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
If you travel there between sort of December, January, February, which is high season, it's very, very busy with people. So as much as the sites are very worthwhile, for people who prefer to go to places lesser known and where you're very unlikely to see other tourists, the region around Putre, which is the kind of tiny little village at the heart of this part of Chile, very close to again to the border with Bolivia and Peru this time.
Mm-hmm.
This is the destination you need to go to.
Okay, and we're also here by a national park in Chile.
Yes. Basically, Putre is on the doorstep of Parque Nacional Lauca,
Mm-hmm.
and also the Reserva Nacional Las Vicuñas. And Lauca is easier to get to and has this incredible lake called Laguna Changora. And I think it's a sort of 4,200 meters above sea level. So it's tough going when you get there.
Hmm.
But again, it's basically overlooked by this incredible volcano. And the reflection of the volcano in the water. Then you've got so many different types of birds, including occasionally flamingos. It's just such a very beautiful, very tranquil place. And you do genuinely feel like you got to the top of the world somehow.
Excellent. I'm looking at pictures of it, and besides being very high, it also looks breathtaking in other ways.
And then sort of just a bit south of there, Lauca National Park is about an hour and a half's drive from Putre, which is where I recommend people stay. There's a great hotel called Terrace Lodge, which is run by an Italian couple who just know the region so well, and they can arrange tours. Because again, if you have your own vehicle, it is possible. But in terms of the altitude, I actually suffered really bad altitude sickness when I was there, because Putre itself is at 3,200. And the thing is, you drive from sea level to Putre in one day, and that change in altitude can make you very ill. It's better to book a tour through Terrace Lodge, and they can recommend sort of different places to go. But definitely my favorite part was in the Reserva Nacional Las Vicuñas. And it was a salt flat called the Salar de Surire. And again, this is at 4,500 meters above sea level, but it's more impressive than the salt flats you see in San Pedro. It's absolutely huge. There's a huge lake there as well. You're likely to see 3 different types of flamingos feeding there. We didn't see any tourists while we were there at all. And you see lots of wildlife like vicuñas and guanaco, which are basically camelids, and they're basically the wild form of the alpaca and the llama. You just see loads of those trotting around and not bothered by you. And you also see the nandu, which is a type of ostrich. You see those kind of wandering around too. And possibly my favorite is the vizcacha, which is basically a type of chinchilla. You see those a lot sunbathing on rocky outcrops, everything. But just because there's so few tourists there, you see so much wildlife, and everything is so unspoiled and just wild. And it's wonderful.
Excellent. Anything else? Are we done with the itinerary?
Yes.
What is going to surprise me about this northern part of Chile?
I think firstly that it exists, as we've just said. It's just not somewhere that seems to be on anyone's radar. I also think for the variety of things you find, because ultimately all of it is in the Atacama Desert. But actually, you've got the coast, you've got the Altiplano, you've got all these lakes, you've got these salt flats, you've got these volcanoes, you've got areas around Arica, which, because it grows all these olives that are actually quite lush and green. I think for traveling in a desert, you're very surprised by just how varied the terrain and everything is there.
Interesting. Well, and of course we could, if we had more time, add a couple days on to the time we spent flying through Santiago and see a completely different. Now you're seeing something that looks like the Napa Valley of California and wine region and
Hmm.
things like that. So Chile is an amazingly diverse country, especially because it is that long, skinny country.
Yeah.
And even just that 170 miles from east to west is going from coastal to high mountains. So fascinating country.
Mm.
One warning you would give about going to this part of Chile. Altitude sickness is one. Anything particular we can do about that other than booking a tour?
With altitude sickness, it's just respecting the fact that altitude sickness is very serious. It can actually kill.
Mm-hmm.
And in Arica, you can take a tour up to the Altiplano, up to Lago Chungara, and they're known by the locals as the vomi tours because by the end of the day, everybody is vomiting. So
I'm not sure
because
that's the best tourism slogan I have heard ever for a particular tour.
it's the tour agencies who aren't selling those type of tours who've labeled them that. It's a case of being aware of the fact that you do need to acclimatize. I know when you go to Putre, it's recommended you stay at least 3 days because you need, I think for every couple of 100 meters you go, you need at least 12 hours of time to acclimatize. So it's just being respectful of the fact that if you try and rush things, you will have a rubbish time. I mean, I ended up being sat there with an oxygen mask
Mm-hmm.
because my oxygen levels had gone too low. I was on a short deadline and I needed to get up as quickly as possible, and it did not work out well.
And that's one of the reasons why we usually say, what would you do a 1 week itinerary? And I think that 2 possibly makes more sense here, just because we need to slow down and stop at some of these places where we're going to altitude and plan in more days where we're not going to do as much.
Exactly. And there's plenty of things to do in all of those places. So if you have a few extra days where you're taking things a bit slower, then you're not going to be bored. There's going to be plenty of things to see at the same time.
Okay. Before I get to my wrap-up questions, anything else we should know before we head to Northern Chile?
As I've said, kind of for a shorter itinerary, so sort of 1 or 2 weeks, can easily rent a car.
Mm-hmm.
The best place to do that, Calama is very expensive actually if you rent it directly from the airport.
Mm-hmm.
There's a city that is not on our itinerary, but it's only about 2 hours from Iquique called Antofagasta, and the prices of rental there are a lot cheaper. It's worth shopping around. You can rent cars in Iquique and Arica as well, but it's worth shopping around to get a good deal. But the roads are in very good condition. The driving is long, the distances are long. You're looking at a couple of hours, sort of 3 hours between the main cities. So take it slow, take lots of breaks, make sure you've got plenty of water and food in your car just in case you do end up getting a flat or something like that. But just enjoy it as well. I think that road tripping around the north of Chile is exceptionally rewarding just because of how much you see. It's just a very interesting, strangely beautiful place to drive, given it's a desert. But it is beautiful.
Okay. And when we talk about several hours between, that sounds like a particularly British perspective that's really, really long. But
yeah.
that's a little bit where you're from, whether you consider that a really long drive or not. Just to put it in perspective, the total driving distance between Calama and Arica is about 10 hours. So if you were to drive this whole way, that would be the perspective of how much time you would spend on the road. Excellent. Some of our wrap-up questions. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Chile.
Okay, it's the fact that everything that you eat will include avocado, some way or shape or form.
Really?
Yeah, they're obsessed with it.
Okay.
And it's great. I love avocado, so I'm not complaining.
I love avocado and guacamole and feel that every avocado that didn't end up in guacamole somehow did not achieve its purpose.
I agree.
You already talked about a particularly beautiful spot, so you may have already answered this, but if you're standing in the most beautiful spot in northern Chile, where are you standing and what are you looking at?
It would either be the Piedras Rojas that I mentioned, that's just south of San Pedro,
Right.
or the Sala de Suriri, which is in the Reserva Nacional Las Vicuñas. Both of those are just mind-blowingly beautiful.
Okay. And the second one had wild llamas, so, there's an advantage there.
Exactly.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize northern Chile in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Sandy, but beautiful.
Excellent. Excellent. And our guest again is Steph Dyson. And Steph, where can people read about your travels?
So you can find me on worldlyadventure.com, and I'm currently in the process of writing a guidebook about Chile. So I'm actually off tomorrow to go and see some parts of the south, so people can find very up-to-date travel information on my blog about Chile.
Okay. When you finish that guidebook, let me know, and we'll put a link in the show notes here to that guidebook when it comes out. That's probably at least a year from now, I'm guessing, if you're still writing it.
It is, yeah. There's a bit more blood, sweat, and tears to get through before it's done.
Well, there's a lot of work for you, and then it's surprising how long it takes for a physical guidebook to get from there to the publisher and out to the bookshelves. So, but let us know, and we'll put a link in this episode. Some people will be listening to this well long after when we're recording this, which is in November of 2017. Steph, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing with us your obvious love for Chile.
No, thank you very much for having me.
In news of the community, I had a fun piece of news from Chandra, former guest on the show, who was on the Amateur Traveler trip to India and also the Amateur Traveler trip 2 years ago to southern Morocco. And the interesting piece of news was that our guide on the Morocco trip, Khalid, just won the World Guide Award. I'll put a link in the show notes, but he was a very terrific guide, apparently the world's best. So that was pretty cool news. I heard from Elspeth about the recent show we did on Kiev. Really enjoyed the Kiev podcast. We visited recently and were really surprised what an attractive city it was and how much there was to see and do. One really full day was not enough. A couple of additional points. We'd recommend the Chernobyl Museum. Not sure if the tour there is compulsory, but if not, take the option. Our tour guide was brilliant and helped us to get the most out of the museum. We also did a 2-day tour to Chernobyl itself and would recommend that. We did it as a photography tour, and there's a huge amount to see and think about and some amazing photos to be taken. A huge radar station, the town of Pripyat, complete with Ferris wheel, dodgems, cinema, cafe, supermarket, etc., surrounded by abandoned villages now looking like Angkor temples, with trees growing through buildings, various monuments, both to Soviet accomplishments and now to the Chernobyl disaster and rescuers, and of course, the reactor. It was a fascinating place, and you can stay in a basic hotel in the outer zone, and certainly on our tour, visit a self-settler, i.e. an original resident who has gone back there to live, and who was a real interesting chap. Thanks so much, Elspeth. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. We're talking about this episode and every episode at the Facebook group, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. And don't forget to join the private Facebook group about the trips that we do, amateurtraveler.com/trips. And thanks so much for listening.